In 1948, the Afrikaner National Party won the national elections, and this quickly led to institutionalized racism in a system called Apartheid. The years leading up to the National Party win included the formation of two institutions which played a large role in the history of South Africa. In 1918, an exclusively male organization called Jong Suid-Afrika, or Young South Africa, was formed. It was later renamed to Die Broederbond, or the Brotherhood. Its purpose was to serve the interests of Afrikaners in South Africa. In the 1930s, the South African government set up a security service modeled after the British MI5 and was a special branch of the South African Police. And later, in 1969, it was renamed to the Bureau of State Security, or BOSS. The purpose of the security service was to monitor state security, but they were allowed to perform other duties as required to keep the status quo.
Music power.
South Africa had a policy which was called apartheid, which meant that blacks and whites should be separated.
In 1948, when the nationalists came to power, they entrenched apartheid as an official policy. I mean, it's, let me say, entrenching historical racism and institutionalizing it.
The official religion of the National Party government was the Dutch Reformed Church, the DRC. Which was very much the whole unification of politics and religion was part of the National Party's method of control. There was a secret organization or semi-secret organization called the Broederbond, which literally is Afrikaans for brother band, brother union. You would not get a high political position within the government or indeed in any of its organs such as the SABC unless you were a fully signed up member of the Broederbond, which meant you'd have to be a member of the NGK, the Nederlandse Gereformeerde Kerk.
They passed several laws quickly in the first few years as kind of linchpin laws for apartheid.
You would have laws saying where people of certain races could live, specific areas in which people of different races could live. Your kind of overarching blueprint was the division of a population into race. Your African, as it was put, your white, and then your coloreds, as they were called, mixed race people, as they would refer to themselves to, and then subgroups, Chinese, who were kind of seen as other races.
And then the laws, possibly as controversial as any, the Immorality Act and the Mixed Marriages Act, which effectively made it a crime to have sex or marry across racial divide. The intention of the government or their publicity was that all of these acts really just separate the races, but they're still equal. Whereas, of course, as we remember from George Orwell's Animal Farm, it was another case of they are all equal, but some are very much more equal than others.
Amongst the many policies that the government had in this separation, the apartheid, was different beaches for different races, park benches that were only for the white and others for blacks. And in actual fact, they called them non-whites. We were whites and they were non-whites. You'd have a situation where at first they had bus routes only for blacks. No whites could get on these buses. And then later, in trying to appease the international community, in trying to bring about some kind of liberalization, a black person could get on a bus, but they had to sit at the back. Even in health, there was a discrepancy between what whites got and what blacks got. This led to appalling living conditions in the townships, appalling.
They introduced what were called international hotels, whereby five-star hotels could apply, and some five-star hotels in each of the main cities received international status, and this meant that they were entitled to accommodate visiting or foreign VIPs who were non-white.
You had people like Dr. Christian Barnard, you had the Shah of Iran, and other famous people there at night, you know, all mingling together. So in that sense, there wasn't any apartheid in the International Hotel.
Communications was incredibly important to the way apartheid worked. Apartheid wasn't something that was purely racially based. It was something that was very carefully structured for economic reasons as much as race, as ones of race. So the whole essence of communication was that you control the means of communication.
The news that South Africa was hearing at the time was not just censored by the government, but it was created by the government.
And you tell the people what you want them to hear. In order to do that, you've got to have sole control over the method of communication, which in South Africa was the South African Broadcasting Corporation. Nobody else had a license. Nobody else could broadcast from within the borders of South Africa itself.
To ensure that the have-nots didn't become discontent or even subversive, censorship was inevitable. And of course became more and more rigid as time went on. And it wasn't censorship just of news broadcasting. It was censorship of popular music lyrics as well. You know, anything that had any kind of communist idea or anything irreligious or blasphemous, as they would say, or anything that was immoral, got the chop as far as the SABC was concerned, either banned outright or certainly you know, censored.
Artists like Dire Straits, who had contributed to an ANC benefit concert, Pink Floyd.
There was a band called Blue Mink who did a song called Melting Pot, which was promoting the idea that what we need is the world needs to be one great big melting pot and that we'll turn out coffee-coloured people by the score. So that was banned from broadcast.
The Police, purely because of their name, the Police were banned by the SABC. And obviously they wouldn't play music from exiles like Hugh Masekela, who at the time I remember had a massive hit, a great song, great tune, Grazing in the Grass. It was, I think, a number 4 in America, wasn't heard in South Africa.
I remember we had a guy called Tinus Oosterhuizen, and I'm naming a name now because the guy's passed on. He was in charge of the library at the SABC. And if he didn't like it, he'd take a 6-inch nail and go across the record. So you went to the library to pull it out to play on the show, and wow, you couldn't play it. The first one he ever scratched, I remember Jim Croce's Cocaine. Oh, that was a no-go. That was definitely not going to happen. Shame, really. Everybody loved a bit of cocaine in those days.
There is a committee within the SABC who listen to all the music that's released, or all possibly contentious music. And although I say I'm not on that committee, I don't know of its workings. The reason why they may restrict certain records from airplay is because they feel that certain music may offend listeners. When you're in a disco, you can jive to an 18-minute track of Donna Summer, or anybody else for that matter. To listen to an 18-minute track of Donna Summer on what is essentially medium wave radio, on a small speaker, on a small radio, just doesn't go down.
South Africa only got television in 1976. We weren't able to see the moon landing. We weren't able to see many of the historic events that the rest of the world saw. And the reason for that was that Parliament decided that television was evil, so we wouldn't have it.
Again, to prevent the repressed masses, if I can call them that, from getting a window on the world and seeing how the other half live.
The Homelands Policy, as it was called, meant that Zulus would stay in one area, the Xhosas would stay in another area, the Lesedis in another area, and therefore their propaganda would go to those different nations, and under the guise of what they called Bantu radio. And then the white population who were watching SABC after 1976, that is, and listening to SABC radio, were totally in the dark about what was happening in the country. With the creation of these homelands, it meant that South Africa saw them as independent, totally independent sovereign states. But the world, of course, wasn't fooled by that. The world knew that this was just another way of implementing apartheid, the separation of the people. And watching what was happening in the country at the time with the uprisings, with the bloodshed, with this total domination of one race over another, that I think the germ started for Capital Radio.
We listened to Capital 194 in London, who had started in 1972, had actually kind of picked up all the talent from the pirate radio stations of the 1960s, the ships that were anchored in the North Sea and were illegal and broadcast into, into not just London, but all the way up the coast. And so we, remembering the romance of that and the fact that they were illegal, but a deal was done and they were brought on shore, and in exchange, the government agreed to start independent radio in England or in the UK. So we were fired up with, that's what we want to do, but where can we do it? We suddenly had the thought, what about this newly declared independent state called Transkei? Because from there we can broadcast into South Africa. So with a little bit of research, we discovered that in the Independence Charter of Transkei, there was absolutely no mention of broadcasting at all. It was just in the Nats' kind of usual arrogant way. They had assumed that, of course, the SABC would still continue to operate in these territories. So they didn't even think about making sure that that was legally binding. So there was no reason why we shouldn't legally broadcast from Transkei.
Martin Rattle ran a mobile discotheque company with his partner Mike Forge, and on his team were Anthony Duke, Brian Oxley, and the late Jim Ellery, amongst others. During this time, Martin was introduced to John Moody, who expressed an interest in getting into the entertainment business.
We were invited to go around to John Moody's house for drinks. And when we got there, I think Martin Rattle may have been there, but there was plans all over the coffee table, and they were showing us plans of outside broadcast units and studios and what was actually going to be happening as far as this radio station. I was saying, what radio station?
So in the end, with the help of Brian Oxley and Jim Ellery, the late Jim Ellery, and Anthony Duke, who was on our team, we put together a proposal and a tape of what it would sound like. We sent Richard Bruce in to bat for us in Transkei, and not really not daring to hope that it might go anywhere. And they said, it sounds like a brilliant idea. Put together a more in-depth proposal, and how do you see it working? Well, first of all, of course, we saw it working along the lines of Capital 194 in London. They were already the most popular independent radio station in the world. They had the highest listenership, and they had, they were fully booked advertising sales-wise for 3 years. So, in fact, if you wanted to buy advertising on Capital London, you had to go and put your name down for 3 years' time. And then it's just a question of how do we do it? We've got to find out technically how to do it, and who's going to pay for it. We formulated and proposed, and which was accepted, a company whereby the Transkei government held 51% of the shares, Professor Bruce, John Moody and Martin Rattle had 26% of the shares, and the remaining 23 was held over for future issue to Transkei citizens. That arrangement took place on the basis that they will put up all the money, the Transkei government, and we'll put in the expertise and do the legwork and report to the board and bring contracts and so on and so on.
We felt compelled to try and bring the real South African situation to the more elite, shall we say, population who were not hearing the news. And we felt that a popular radio station with a totally independent news team would get the message to those who did not know what was going on in the country. It was important to note that Capital Radio hadn't identified its target market as being black. It had identified its target market as being the white ignorance of what was going on. So make a popular radio station, a music radio station that serves the community, and give them news that they would not find on any SABC radio channel. News that told the truth of the situation.
Well, now, of course, there were various aspects to setting up a radio station like that. If we start with the programming side, well, we'd already got our kind of focus in Capital 194, and John Moody and I went over to London and we went to see them. Must have been 1977 just, I think. And we actually said to them, look, maybe you want to buy a shareholding, you know, maybe we'll sell you some of ours, or maybe the government will, you know, agree to a new way of formulating the shareholding. They said, well, we're flattered, but we can't do it because as far as the rest of the world is concerned, Transkei doesn't exist. It is South Africa, and our unions would not let us get involved in something there. But please help yourselves to anything that you want here. But we said, well, we'd like to use the name, but just convert it because we will be Capital 604.
The payoff lines were the same. All the hits and more on 194, all the hits and more on 604.
It actually should have been Capital 603 because we were on 603 kilohertz medium wave. But of course, 603 doesn't rhyme with all the hits and more. So we call it 604. You can't see the difference on the dial.
Capital were known for their absolutely tremendous jingles. Their ID identifying jingles were put together by the lead singer of a very famous 60s group called the Dave Clark Five. And Mike Smith was the lead singer and pianist.
A whole load of us, in fact probably all of us, went to somebody's farm just outside Port St. John's. I forget whose farm. And so we were all there. Mike said, because we were only going from like 5 o'clock in the morning until midnight. And so but Mike said, you know, we're going to need like a signing off jingle that says, you know, well, thank you for listening today, kind of thing. And I was actually tinkling on the piano, just having a tinkle. And he then pulled up a chair and sat down behind him. And it was, he said, play that again. And it turned into, thank you, good night.
Good night. We sure had a great day. We'd just like you to know you've been listening to Capital Radio.
Yeah, quite proud of that. Just, you know, I probably put in 1% and Mike put in 99%, but at least we sat down together at the piano.
We again got Bill Mitchell to revoice the deep voice drop-in package, especially tailor-make it for us.
Nothing but classics from the 70s. Solid gold, #1.
When we got permission from Capital London to use their logo, that was for us a prize jewel. And Capital London had a Cockney sparrow as in their logo, and we changed that to a Wild Coast seagull. To us, that symbolized freedom and flying out of this mess that our country was in. Capital London at the time, 194, was the first independent radio station that was opened in the UK. And it was the brainchild of one Michael Bucht. Michael was an Anglo-Indian Muslim who was probably one of the best radio people in the world. And when we approached Capital London, he was busy opening up a capital in Jamaica and one in Singapore as well.
Sir Richard Attenborough, the chairman of Capital London, said, no, look no further than Michael Bucht if you need somebody to show you how to do radio, basically. So we got him to agree to a 3-year contract, and he came over to Port St John's to help us set the radio station up, and particularly to program it, to select the staff and to look at available listenership as to what type of programming one should do, basically hour by hour.
And then in the spring, I think it was, of 1979, I was approached by a guy called John Whitney, who was the managing director at Capital in London, to get some help setting up a radio station. And he knew me well enough to know that I wasn't terribly keen on the apartheid regime in South Africa. Indeed, I was one of those people who didn't even buy outspan oranges. And he said to me, no, he thought this was very different, because this one was going to be exploiting the strange rules of apartheid and was going to be an organization that was multiracial and would, in many ways, he hoped, begin to, in broadcasting at least, help change the face of South Africa. Well, I was still a bit alarmed, but I consulted a couple of people in the anti-apartheid movement in England, who both of them they were familiar with South Africa. They had connections and all were South African originally, and both of them said if there was going to be a multiracial radio station that had a chance of making some waves of influencing things, it was a really good idea. So I ought to try and do it. I agreed to give it a go, not to stay there forever, but to set it up and mentor it for about 5 years after it started.
So we just had to find somewhere to house this radio station and in Transkei, and somewhere where there was accommodation for these people. I mean, not these people from overseas who aren't thinking in terms of bringing their family over to live in a rondavel. So we found Port St John's.
An idyllic spot on the coast. The Umzimvubu River flowed into the ocean there. We set up our studios in the old port captain's house, probably made in the late 1800s, this house.
And it was absolutely ideal for the studios. And the other side of the Umzimvubu River was a complex which had been a kind of holiday complex, I think, in the 60s and early 70s, called Ferry Point, which was really rondavels and so on. And we converted that, and we put power in and water, and so that was a major upgrade, and so that it could then accommodate the people who we started to bring to Port St John's in about, well, I think I arrived there July 1979.
I actually went, when I was on the Sunday Express, to interview Gary Edwards about starting this whole new radio station and this new newsroom. And at the end of the interview, he said to me, would you like to come and work in the newsroom? And I said, yes.
I got a phone call from Alan Mann. They're looking for a drive time presenter who sounds like Roger Scott. And you're right there, pal, because Roger was my mentor. So I said, okay, fine, put my name down. So I got the job.
I flew down to Port St John's, got into Mtata, got into a rather interesting looking Land Rover, that needed a few spares put onto it. And by the time I got to Port St John's, I understood where all the Land Rover bits had fallen off, because we actually stopped and picked a few up on the way back. And then got to the studios down in Port St John's, did a voice test there, met Martin Rattle, met Stuart Lee, who interviewed me. And they offered me a job there and then and said, can you start immediately, like as of today? I phoned people up in Joburg and said, fabulous, I'm not coming back, I'm here.
And in '79, they came to me and they actually flew me down to Port St John's, Tata, and then drove me down to Port St John's. And then we had auditions there. And then, of course, they were quite impressed with my voice and everything, and they thought they could do something with me.
That's Algero when he's distracted, just like me. Why? Because I had a love, but it's no more there.
And this was at the beginning of my radio career, you know, I just started. So I got this break and I went down to Transkei and I started on a more professional setup now, radio station, state-of-the-art equipment, everything. So it was like, boom. I was in the world of commercial radio. And at that time, you must know, commercial radio was like a novelty in this country for black people, you see what I mean? So, in other words, we're used to these traditional stations like radio, Zulu, you know, Sotho, all the different languages, you see. But there wasn't any black man who was broadcasting in English on radio.
Capital Radio came about 6 months after I joined the SABC. And a whole group of people from what was then called Radio Today, which was an English morning news show, moved en masse to Capital Radio. People that I actually happened to respect and who'd been trying to do their best despite the controls that was such a central part of SABC. So you had people like Gary Edwards, who was the first news editor, Julian Potter, Michael Atelier, Will Bernard, all people who moved and all vastly more experienced than I was. So I thought, okay, went along and spoke to Gary Edwards and said, yeah, well, I'd like to do this. I'd also like to jump and come. So that's how it happened.
Once the team was fully assembled, the work began to start and run a new radio station. The atmosphere was one of hard work, collaboration, and enjoyment.
There were ups, there were downs, there were, you know, as I mentioned, they brought an awful lot of guys from the UK, straight out of high-tech, what was then high-tech UK, to the jungle. With paraffin stoves and paraffin refrigerators, which I didn't even know, existed. So there was this whole conglomeration of different people, together with South Africans as well.
Yeah, it was a wild vibe. It was a wild vibe. We'd mix up with, I had girlfriends, some guys had wives and everything, so we'd mix and have parties almost every day, We're really living rough, but very happy. And we're earning good bread, so we're cool, eh?
Every weekend, we would go to Martin Rattle's house. This is Port St John's. We would go to Martin Rattle's house and we would have a braai, if it was on a Saturday, or Sunday lunch, if it was on a Sunday. I mean, he would spit roast and do everything. It was brilliant.
Then, of course, there was the technical side, which was more important than anything because, of course, that is where the money is going to be spent to start with. And this was really the department of Professor Bruce, who was our chairman at that stage as the fledgling company was founded, and John Moody, who was managing director. And between them, they researched and found, they started talking to Marconi in Switzerland, but they were then referred to a firm of broadcast consultants who were based in the Channel Islands, who had set up radio and TV stations all over the world and became highly recommended. The essential thing was for us to be able to reach not just the rest of South Africa, but in particular the PWV triangle, Joburg being the commercial centre, most important, but and that we had to reach. So we were assured that if we bought the largest transmitter in the Southern Hemisphere, which was a megawatt transmitter, that would provide an acceptable 66 dB signal into Johannesburg, as well as reaching Durban and East London and Port Elizabeth and Bloemfontein. We knew we wouldn't be able to reach Cape Town, but we had a shortwave service as well, so that was, well, would reach Cape Town, would reach all over the world in actual fact. That was agreed to, and the big transmitter was bought and installed at a place up in the mountains in Transkei called Herschel.
The consultants who Capital Radio hired to plan the studio's transmitter and antenna included Bob McIntyre and Reg Swain. Once Herschel was chosen as the location for the transmitter and antenna, Bob McIntyre was given the job of convincing the local chief whose tribe owned the land to let them build there. The chief did not want anything built on his land, and Bob McIntyre negotiated for many weeks before an agreement was reached.
We also had a smaller transmitter in Mthatha for broadcasting through Transkei into the then Eastern Cape, and another at Umzimkhulu to boost the signal into the Natal region.
Transkei had infrastructure that was still dated the 1940s. It was old wind-up telephones. You used to crank them up and a manual exchange person used to say hello and you asked for the telephone number. Now you're suddenly going to run a stereo radio station on this sort of equipment. So they realized there was a problem to get the signal from Port St. John's to Mthatha. So Capital built the first microwave, it was analog at the time, analog microwave service between Port St. John's to Mthatha, and that's how they got the audio. It was a stereo system. They've now got a reasonably good signal in Mthatha from Port St. John's. Now they've got to get it to Herschel. How do they get it to Herschel? It's along telephone lines, along rural roads. Herschel wasn't designed even to give the power. When that transmitter was fully modulating, the lights right on the Eskom line, the lights in Lady Grey, the town, used to pulse at night with the modulation. It used to drive the people mad.
While the technical aspects were being worked on, at the same time, the newly formed news team was coming up with a way to tell the real news in an impartial and unbiased way.
So we had to create a way in which to ensure that without dictating what you do, you create what is going to be a recognized independent radio style. So in consultation with Michael Buck, we drew up a new style guide, which was very all-encompassing.
We were the first in South Africa not to use honorifics, but that was quite a breakaway thing from radio at the time. We also had to be non-sexist. We were very sort of strong on that kind of thing. And we weren't going to call everybody out there fighting in the struggle terrorists.
One man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. Terrorist is much pejorative and an inaccurate term as freedom fighter is. So we use the word guerrilla, which is as middle of the road as you can get.
So we had to look for neutral ways of telling the story of South Africa. And we were quite strict about that, and we produced the style guide and we sent it out to all our stringers and correspondents as well.
But it was a very important process because for the first time in South Africa you had a group of people transforming the very structure on which media worked. And for the first time you had it being put down of this is what independent news should all be about. This is what it means. We've lived in a society for decades in which the concept of independent media and concept of independent music, of independent art is completely non-existent. You had a situation in which it was state-sanctioned or it was resistance. Somehow you had to get something in the two if you were ever going to have a true democracy emerge from the apartheid ashes. And that's where the process began in that tiny newsroom at Capital Radio, in creating some kind of template that looked forward to a society in which people would be free and in which news would be independent without you having to work it to be so.
the ethos of Capital was to get at the truth from the news department side, and from the presentation side, it was to present and work without seeing colour.
For the first time, we were going to open up a radio station that wouldn't be all white presenters, or as the SABC's Bantu services were, all black presenters. We wanted a mix.
Most of the guys who were white on the station were actually from abroad, you see. Most of them were from England, America, and all that. So, you know, they seemed genuine. We had local guys as well who had to follow suit because, I mean, everybody else was nice to us and as blacks. So there wasn't actually any demarcation. Everybody treated each other like brother and sister and what have you. So we're just one big happy family. Capital was more like, you know, much of a mix where we're doing the same kind of work, all of us, you see, being different colors. So it was quite a genuine multiracial setup.
And we were all playing good songs, Randy Crawford songs, Crusaders, you know, George Benson, you know, and mixed in amongst all the other white songs that were around. It was just good music and the way radio should be, yeah.
We classified our music in rough genres of the white pop, rock, R&B, jazz, and then what we would actually consider to be the emerging crossover music market between black and white. I mean, one must remember that on the ground, under the radar and occasionally being picked up by the South African police, there were people making music, and that was a broader spectrum. But they were getting no airtime at all. There was no outlet for them. And Capital would be that outlet.
So I had to meet Michael Bucht, and he was conducting business from his penthouse in Ponte Building in Johannesburg. And he was interviewing everybody there, mainly the DJs. And I went to meet him. And in fact, he was trying to listen and decide what was going on the playlist. And he listened to Johnny Clegg's Jaluka, and I can't remember the actual track, but I remember him saying, "We're playing this." And he just listened for the first 3 seconds, and he said, "This one we're having on." And they said, "Well, it doesn't actually meet the language policy, which was English rather than any other language, because it had some Zulu words in it." And he said, "Never mind, for this song, we're going to play it." And so he deviated from policy for that. And I think Capital probably made Johnny Clegg and Jaluka, because they certainly gave him lots of airtime.
An important part of preparing to start a radio station is to practice and perfect your presentation. Leading up to the station going on air, the presenters and news staff did mock broadcasts under the watchful eye of Michael Bucht.
I started in 1979 with the dry runs. So I actually came on board before we started broadcasting, and we spent 6 months just acting as if we were in a newsroom.
We ran for a full month with dummy runs and mock broadcasts, 24/7.
Yeah, we're just doing dry runs, getting lessons from Michael Bucht. He had a huge stick, you know. I think he had an accident in his foot, so he used that stick to actually plonk anyone on the head or something like that if he didn't get what he wanted, you know. So he was there even when we were practicing and doing dry runs. He would be there, you know, watching very carefully and making gesticulations like, your mouth wide, you know. He was a very nice but very strict man, yeah. And he knew exactly what he wanted. So we're busy doing the dry runs, practicing, familiarizing ourselves with music and everything. And so it was quite a busy month or two before we actually went on air.
The date was set for the 26th of December, 1979, to open the radio station the day after Christmas. Everybody gathered. We were all very excited. We had been working for months in putting together our library, putting together our music, putting together our presentation, our lineup.
I don't think any of us had had more than 3 or 4 hours sleep in as many days, but that didn't stop us all getting up at the crack of dawn and cramming into the studio to witness the first broadcast of what was, after all, the first independent commercial medium wave radio station in Southern Africa.
And the station was sounding great when we switched on that transmitter that first time. The first song we played was Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water, symbolic of trying to actually put more than a Band-Aid on the pain of South Africa.
The whole thing kicked off with Alan Mann, the first disc jockey on air with his breakfast show, and before him, of course, our original MD, John Moody's opening few words. I remember them very well.
The date is December the 26th, 1979. The time, 6 a.m. This is the moment when a dream becomes a reality, and only time now will prove what this reality will mean to the peoples of Southern Africa. This then, from Transkei, for the very first time, is Capital Radio.
And 10 minutes later, something happened, and we went off air.
The stories are wide and varied. The ones I can remember is that Lesotho was made up of chalk mountains and therefore absorbed the signal. Subsequent investigations have revealed that the ground mat, you know, with an AM transmitter, you have to have a copper ground mat. And apparently there was a road running next to the transmitter, and they had never connected up the ground mat across the road. So what eventually happened, you know, I'm not really into the big transmission technicalities, but from what I was told, what happened was the signal bounced back on itself and blew the transmitter. It was quite a large transmitter in Herschel because of that ground mat not being connected.
That sneaky suspicion that the Bureau of State Security of the South African government had a hand in influencing that decision not to put the ground plate in properly.
It's documented in the Herschel transmitter logbooks that capacitors in the antenna tuning unit, which was a separate building, blew, and this caused the antenna to go off-air after 10 minutes into the first day's broadcast. However, the reason for this incident has never been revealed, so all we are left with is speculation.
We'd had problems in the weeks of tests leading to the actual launch. There had been a growing awareness that the size of the transmitter was not sufficient for the breadth of signal that had been promised by the contractors. Yet there was still, oh, it's going to be all right on the day. Well, it wasn't. I truly tend to think that it was more a engineering issue than a political one.
The Herschel transmitter was brought back on air after the capacitors were replaced. Once it was back on air, it then became evident that the signal was too weak to penetrate buildings in Johannesburg.
We were promised by the consultants that we got from overseas through Marconi that we would get 65 dBs into Johannesburg, and they told us that would be an acceptable signal.
Nowhere did they suggest who could hear it or in which particular areas or how strongly can they hear it. That was technical, 66 dB, and that's what we achieved.
We were told that we promised you 65 dBs in Johannesburg, but we didn't tell you that it wouldn't penetrate a single building.
To have a proper, reasonable AM signal in a city, you need 70 dBs, not 65 or less.
A medium wave signal travels along the ground during the day. Because of this, the ground it travels over must be a good conductor, or in other words, must have good ground conductivity. Reg Swain from the consulting company didn't conduct ground conductivity studies and based his calculations for the transmitter and antenna on ground conductivity conditions in Europe. This was a fatal mistake because, as it turned out, the Herschel site had very bad ground conductivity.
And that is where we first suspected that perhaps there'd been some underhand dealings from the South African government to possibly persuade the consultants not to let us have that strength.
So the question was to go to international court, I don't know where it would be, in The Hague, or would it be in Switzerland, or wherever it would be, to fight this issue and to, you know, have a legal team and more money from Transkei to go and fight this and risk losing the case too on that technicality. That, along with the fact that there were whispers that perhaps the state president of Transkei had a different kind of relationship with these people than we knew about, and that therefore he wasn't keen to sue people that he had a relationship with. Again, that's hearsay, if you like, or folklore, but there could be some truth in that, I think. After 6 months and the signal was not put right, had not, been improved to Johannesburg, then the board of directors and the majority shareholders were looking for scapegoats. And so at our board meeting in Umtata at the Holiday Inn I think it was June or July 1980, we were surprised, Richard, John and I, when we went to the board meeting, to have the rest of the board saying, by the way, this is Transkei board members, Transkei government representatives, that before we do any business today, we need to, it's a year since we last had this sort of meeting, we need to all stand down from the board and then put ourselves up for re-election before we do anything. And so we said, why? No, it's law, you have to. So we said, no, I don't think we want to do that. No, but we have to. Well, in the end, one of them, I think it was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, took John Moody outside and gave him his absolute undertaking that there's nothing dodgy about this at all. You're just getting paranoid. It's just a formality and everything will be just fine. So John came back in and went, okay, to Richard and I, well, we can do it. So we stood down, they all stood down, and then one by one we were put up for re-election. Richard Bruce, the chairman, no votes, our votes, but nobody else. John Moody, managing director, our votes, but nobody else. Martin Rattle, program director, no, only the other two. So basically we were kicked off the board. But then they said, okay, but listen, don't panic, don't go anywhere. Stay at the Holiday Inn tonight, because then we'll convene a meeting tomorrow to discuss the way forward. But don't go out of the hotel, okay? You stay in the hotel. So we had a chat amongst ourselves after the meeting and we thought, no, don't like the sound of that. So we actually got in a car quite late, and it was midwinter, and we drove through the mountains and through over to Bloemfontein on the other side. And we caught the first flight back to Cape Town. So when everybody came to the office the next morning, we were in Cape Town. And so there started a tug of war, because the staff in Port St. John said, well, you either return these guys, or we'll close up. And then eventually the negotiating was, well, okay, if John Moody and Richard Bruce won't come because they want to negotiate from a distance, send us Martin Rattle. So they said, you're mad because your life's in danger. And I said, no, I don't believe it would be at all. I think that I have no problem with anybody in Transkei at all, so I have no fear of going back there. And that was actually an emotional time. I remember arriving back in Port St. John's and the staff coming down the hill from the radio station to meet me and carry me on their shoulders back up to the studio, which is probably the most emotional moment in my Capital Radio history.
After Martin Rattle, Richard Bruce and John Moody fled to Cape Town, sometime later they returned to the radio station after more negotiations with the Transkei government.
Firstly, there was where did the blame lie for the failure of the transmitter, and who was behind this. And it was, amongst us, it was already thought that there was a big influence of the South African government. And we were proved totally right a few weeks later when Transkei government insisted on owning 100% of the radio station, which was in effect forced on them by the South African government, because the South African government supplied the Transkei with its finances, controlled its economic output, controlled its trade, and they were compliant. They were compliant to such a degree that the managing director of Capital Radio, John Moody, was summoned to a meeting with the new regime, shall we say, from Port St. John's, which was on the coast, to the capital of Transkei, which is Mthatha, which was probably about 90 k's inland.
John said, okay, we were all thinking, oh, well, something's happening, this is good, you know, let's hope there's some resolution. So John took off in his BMW up the road from Port St. John's to Mthatha, and when he got about halfway there at Eagle's Nest, where the road takes a series of bends, he came round the corner and there was a car across the road. So he slowed down, and as he slowed down to see, well, what's happened, has there been an accident or what, 3 guys came up the side of the, down below the road and started shooting at him. So he managed to somehow drive the car round this other car with 2 wheels hanging over the edge of the cliff, so to speak. And he drove and he drove and he drove, and we don't know where he drove to. I still don't know to this day where he drove to, but then he started phoning from somewhere distant. It might have been Durban, or it might have been Bloemfontein, or it might have even been Johannesburg by that time. And to kind of threaten that he would go to the Sunday Times unless this happened and that happened and that happened. Which didn't happen because already, as we were saying, I think that board of directors had already taken good lessons from the Nationalist Party on how to procrastinate and how to put off till tomorrow, which you don't have to make a decision on today. So, yeah, John was lucky to be alive. I mean, one bullet very nearly hit him. It was only about an inch away from his head.
There's no question that Transkei, at least, was riddled with people who worked for the South African government, even though they theoretically were independent Transkeians. I mean, I'm not going to mention names here, but one of the senior engineering people who was working for us, one evening after he'd had a few too many drinks, showed me his boss identity card. So I'm aware that there was more going on than met the eye.
There was always the belief that we had state security spies in the office. My position on that was, look, there's no point in speculating about it. Let's just assume that there are. We have got nothing to hide. We just carry on and do our jobs as we see fit. Don't even, I wouldn't even talk about the fact that 100% certain somewhere among us is a spy, but what does it matter? There's nothing to hide. There's nothing that we need to be scared of or concerned about.
I've heard stories that was there a boss agent on the staff of Capital Radio or close to it, and was this part of the reason why our signal wasn't what it should be, or whether there was any, undermining our, our technical ability. When we set up, the chief engineer was a guy called Ralph Williams. He was our first engineer. When he left, John van Hoogstraten was appointed as chief engineer. We were very hopeful he'd now be able to drive the whole thing of getting the thing sorted out and getting us on air as we should have been. But he'd worked for the SABC, and I don't know who his contacts were. I don't know whether he may have been a Broeder Bond member himself.
He definitely had contact with people in the South African government. Yeah, no, there's no doubt. He had to leave the SABC. They asked him to leave and take up that post, and they built him a brand new house in Mthatha for that.
But I think we all put a lot of pressure on him, and still we didn't get results, and so we weren't sure whether we could criticize him for incompetence or for deliberately dragging his heels. But I know there was a lot of argument and a lot of discontent that we weren't moving forward and that he was in charge of the technical department. So one must form one's own conclusions, I think.
That signal was so bad that look, if it was incompetence, it was pretty gross incompetence. This wasn't just something Jerry built in South Africa. This was supposed to be a sophisticated transmission system that had met international grades for a particular type of signal to go over a particular reach. It didn't.
There was no option but to redirect our transmitters and get two new ones, in fact, one spreading north from the most northern part of Transkei and one going south from the most southern part of Transkei to look after the city of Durban and the city of East London. That was the compromise that we had to make, which also meant cutting our costs dramatically in terms of regional representation around the whole country. It was a compromise that we felt was still commercially viable. No matter how the South African government would try and stop us, we continued. We continued to fight for the right to broadcast, and we continued to fight for the right of the people to hear the real news as it was. The following we had at Capital would put up with it. And they told us that. They told us that we know what a problem you're having. We know what a battle it must be against the bigger forces. But trust us, you've got a following that will last forever.
Now that the station had retooled to be a local station, it went on to become very popular in its reduced broadcast area, continuing to tell the real news and play censored music. The station's listenership grew, and they were involved in many local activities and causes, and took part in many local trade shows.
Well, bearing in mind, before Capital Radio graced our airwaves in 1979, we really had the state broadcaster, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, as the only option. And when Capital Radio launched, amongst great fanfare, I think, in the country, it really, it was something that I think most South Africans, especially those who were on the progressive side, welcomed with open arms.
There was this cult following, and there is still to this day. You see more and more people, you had no idea that, how many people actually would go and find the station.
The brand was so strong, 604 clothing people used to wear, bikinis to the beach and proudly display their T-shirts and stickers on cars and their bags. So it really was something that defined South African pop culture, especially in the 80s. It made us proud to wear a name and a brand of a radio station on our T-shirts and on our bags. And as a listener of Capital Radio in the 80s, I must be honest, I did harbor some dream of at least meeting presenters from Capital, let alone eventually one day sitting in one of those studios at South Beach in Durban and touching the same sliders that the legends before me had touched and played such a significant role, just not in my upbringing, but I think defined an entire generation of people, which is why, decades later, this radio station is still remembered, still loved, and still desired.
There were two aspects to Capital Radio which captivated me. One was the quality of DJing. In the early 80s, it took us away from, Radio Port Natal and Springbok Radio and those sort of radio stations, where the DJs sort of spoke down to you.
Capital Radio was radically different for the better. And it really had a profound effect on my life and on our lives as youngsters growing up. Because we didn't have anything like Capital.
Under Apartheid, we all lived in our own little areas. There were, group areas. The Indians lived in one area, the blacks lived in another area, the whites lived in another area. And we never really interacted with other people. But when you listen to the radio station, everybody sort of interacted together. People phoned in white, black, colored, Indian, blue, green, pink. Everybody phoned in. I remember Alan Mann on his breakfast show used to have a thing called Capital School Time, I think it was. And different people from different schools wrote letters to Alan Mann. And I sort of just listened to him read out those letters. And we sort of learned, the different circumstances that different people endured, different conditions, particularly amongst the blacks. This guy had to walk so many kilometers to school, etc., etc. And it sort of created that awareness within us. It brought people together. You had white people, whites calling in and sort of discussing their life as well. Indians calling in, and it was really a microcosm. It brought the people of South Africa together on this one little hub. Something that we would have to wait another, 15 years or so afterwards to actually have achieved.
Capital Radio was a very successful brand, a very successful business, a very successful community type radio station. And I say community, although it spread wired, but they engaged with their community. Capital Radio seemed to bring people together.
I was one of those people, one of the fans as a teenager. If I knew Capital Radio DJs were around, I would be there at the Royal Agricultural Show in Pietermaritzburg here in KwaZulu-Natal. And Dave Simons was very kind to me one day, and I think it really not just made my day, but made my year that I got to speak to Dave. And I think eventually for me, being based in Durban, having the radio station, arrive in Durban, the radio presenters, especially in the 80s, right, and early 90s, the likes of Tony Blewett and Kevin Savage and Darren Scott and Dave Gazzelli, Tony Morrell, who was one of my favorites. Wherever they went, they were highly recognized, and they were all excellent radio people. And at the end of the day, that's what Capital Radio really delivered to the South African audiences. It was world-class radio.
The ANC simply didn't have the military might to go up against the South African Defence Force. The other way to do it was through things like bombings, little bombings, bombing of shopping centres, to create a sense of instability in the country, which sort of shook a lot of the white population as well, because they were very oblivious as to what was happening out of their communities. And not that, they were not bad people, they just didn't know what was happening. And sanctions in the country at the time were playing in the later 80s were starting to bite. So I think what Capital Radio also did was it acted as a medium that sort of pulled a lot of these things together. It created that awareness,
And I then got to an age where news became relevant in my life. The content of the news was fantastic. It told us what was going on in South Africa. It told us what we weren't really accustomed to hearing. What we weren't privy to those kind of stories. Well, they weren't stories. It was news, relevant news items.
So it created this. It gave this impression of a country that was sort of united in saying, "Hey, we need to end apartheid," and it was a glue that sort of helped pull things together and integrate things. Because with the news broadcasts of actually telling the people what is happening, as opposed to the SABC stations, which put a negative spin onto everything or a positive spin onto everything. So it really did create the impression and really did tell people that yes, your activities are leading to the end of apartheid.
Capital was never a passive listening radio station. You get passive and active listening. And Capital could never be a passive listening station. No one would have Capital on in the background just because that's all there was. People would deliberately go and listen to Capital because it had that sound, and maybe even the medium wave kind of sound with Capital and the DJs and the voices and the way they presented added to that magic, But whereas you can say radio stations today, they are very passive, they have a lot of passive listeners, it's because they have it on, but they're not really listening, they're just hearing it in the background, because there might not be anything else to choose from. Whereas you can quite safely say Capital's audience, whether it was, up to the days when it was 250,000+, which is a hell of a good number for a station that had so many signal issues and was on a medium wave only down in Durban and on the Eastern Cape Coast down to East London. And I used to listen on shortwave in Joburg, and that was an exercise. Very active listeners. You can say that 99% of people that listened to Capital were active listeners. They wanted to hear the station, and it affected a lot of people's lives. And I think that also got up the government's noses that people were actually going to find the station to listen to it. And of course, with the news and the way that was packaged and the message that the news brought across, just got up their noses even more.
When you got into friends' cars, Capital Radio was playing. People used to go out of the way and buy car radios with the medium wave station on it. I remember insisting that my dad bought a new car, and I remember insisting when he installed the radio, it must have medium wave, because he needed to pick up 604. 604 was always the radio station of choice. No, in fact, I don't remember anybody of my generation ever listening to anything else other than 604. It was always the station that was playing. And that's why it sort of became such an intrinsic part of our lives.
But fantastic radio station. Absolutely fantastic radio station. Fondly loved and very sorely missed. Big time.
The target was, and I took over later on when it still hadn't been resolved, to keep up the fight of negotiating with the South African government to allow us to put relay transmitters on South African soil. You know, in the very beginning, when we went on air and it didn't work, a meeting was held at somewhere on Midrand. I wasn't present, but that I know that South African Foreign Minister Pick Botha attended the meeting, and to all intents and purposes, because of course he was also in charge of the SABC, the minister in charge, that there was kind of, yes, we can certainly look at putting a relay between Johannesburg and Pretoria and running an ADSL line or a microwave current to it. And that was a promise that, of course, once again, was never fulfilled. There was the discussion about whether we could broadcast from inside South Africa. The South African law said no, you know, no independent broadcasting, monopoly to the SABC. But the debate was, what does broadcast mean? Does it mean the studio that it emanates from, or does it mean where it's broadcast out, where the transmitters are, in other words? So our lawyers said, well, we consider that broadcast means the point of leaving the transmitter. Now, your transmitters are, for the moment, in Transkei, so we don't see a problem with you opening a studio in Johannesburg, and the South African Post Office will give you a line if you apply for one. I mean, that became, so we weren't blocked on that.
The reason we moved to Joburg from Port St. John's wasn't really a political thing at all. It was because we were all going crazy. We all had cabin fever.
So they picked up the whole radio station, lock, stock. They moved every single jock and their home and the radio station, the studios, the library, and moved everything up to Johannesburg to Mill Park Gallery.
Because it was like a whole NATO exercise of do your last show in Port St. John's, go up to Joburg. Sure, and it was one a day. NATO exercise.
And so we could do Mervyn John's show from Johannesburg and switch at 12 noon, and Dave Gaselli would take over from Port St. John's in the afternoon.
The last night in Port St. John's, there was the piano, there was booze, you know, maybe half a bottle of this, and we spent the whole night with me playing the piano, Duke on his guitar, and we drank the place dry. And that's how we left Port St. John's.
Capital Radio 604 had been broadcasting the real news since 1979. Later, a new independent station called 702 started in the homeland of Bophuthatswana. It emulated the new style of 604, bringing the real news to more South Africans. In addition, more international media was covering the South African story. This led the South African government to institute a state of emergency in 1986, which included tight control over how news was broadcast. No matter who the media outlet was, the police had to sign off on any news broadcasts.
The emergency regulations were a major problem for us because they restricted incredibly the amount of information that you could put out. For example, if you saw any violence in the townships, which we were seeing on a regular basis, you had to first get it verified by the police before you could report it. So we would go out to the townships, the reporters, and we'd come back having seen these awful clashes between members of the Inkatha Freedom Party with the aid of security services. We would see them arriving in areas of Soweto in armored vehicles, and they would be let out and they would attack the local residents who were mainly ANC supporters. And we'd watch these awful clashes, and a little bit later, after the clashes had reached a terribly violent stage, the police would come in and fire tear gas and disperse everybody. We'd then go back to the radio station with all the sound and all the information, but we had to get it verified first in terms of the emergency regulation. So that was a case of us phoning our police liaison officer. One was appointed to each media outlet, and ours, I remember, was a guy called Colonel Nietling. And more often than not, we'd phone him, we'd give him the information, a lot of detail, the times, the places, what we saw, the sound. He'd listen to our story. It did not happen, he would say. And that meant we could not report it. And that is why so many people in white South Africa because they weren't seeing this violence taking place on their own doorsteps, which is what black South Africans were witnessing on a daily basis. White South Africans were genuinely amazed, confused, confounded, frightened when they found out the levels of violence that was happening in our townships in the 1980s. It was simply not reported because the emergency regulations prevented it from being reported.
We could see when there were police agents there and they would keep an eye on us. We were convinced all our phones were in fact being listened in on, and all our phone calls. And so sometimes we'd have a bit of fun, and just drop in odd words to kind of stir things up. But I personally was never felt personally threatened, but I did know that people were keeping notes and were listening to our broadcasts. But we felt kind of, I suppose, you're young, you're fearless, and you're immortal, and you're doing it for a good reason. And we were bringing balanced journalism, we thought. We weren't trying to be on anyone's agenda. We were trying to bring balanced journalism into the story.
There was constant communication from the ANC guys in exile with the newsroom. We had the playpen where all the DJs sat, and I had the desk right in the far right corner, which happened to have the nightline on it. So anytime reception had gone, that phone would ring, and people would have to answer that phone. So I'd come off air, I think it was 7 o'clock in those days, 6 or 7. I'd come off air and I'd be at my desk putting stuff away and doing some paperwork or whatever, and the nightline would ring. And so often, I became used to almost the schedule. The nightline would ring, I'd answer it, and it would be either, remember, Thabo or Tom. Thabo Mbeki or Tom Sabina from, I think it was Lusaka or Harare, calling to speak to Zahed or David or James, somebody in the newsroom. And I'll never forget the one day James Lorimer, I think, coming to me and saying, listen, if you get a call on the nightline and it's either Thabo or Tom Sabina or one of these guys, please just ask them to hold on because there might be unwelcome guests in the newsroom. And I'll never forget the one day this actually happened. I was sitting at my desk. These two guys walked in to the radio station, and they were clearly security police. They walked into the newsroom, which they used to do regularly, come and check the news bulletin, stuff like that. Nightline rang, and I immediately knew who it was. So I just said, please, can you hold on? And these guys were in there for 10, 15 minutes. Because I was carrying on doing my thing. No names mentioned. And then they walked out, went out the front door, and then I said, hello, you still there? Yes, I'm still here. And put Thabo Mbeki through to the newsroom.
We never knew whether our phones were actually tapped or not, being bugged by the security police. And then on one particular occasion, we found out it was the case because we had inadvertently quoted a banned person. And it was quite a bizarre way in which we found out. We got a phone call on our news line from somebody who didn't identify themselves, but had told us that a man called Libon Mabasa, who at that time was a political activist on the run from the police, and this person phoned us to say that Libon Mabasa had in fact been detained. So we went with the story. We knew this was a credible piece of information, but we didn't attribute it to anybody. We just simply said Libon Mabasa has been detained, and gave a bit of background to the fact that he'd been on the run and a bit of his political past. And then got a call from the security police to say, you've quoted a banned person. So we got the transcript of the bulletin out and a recording, and we said, we've quoted no banned person here. In fact, we've quoted nobody. And the security policeman said, no, actually the person who phoned you was the banned person. And that's when we knew that we had our phones tapped, that they were listening in on our conversations.
It was a tricky time, I think, for especially the guys in the newsroom and management. Just a great bunch of guys having a lot of fun on air, and sort of, the bottom line or underneath through all of this is this is what we were putting out there, and the kind of news that we were doing. Which was basically also our newsroom in communication with the guys in exile.
We always looked for ways to breach the emergency regulations, to circumvent them. And there was one occasion we managed to do this quite successfully, but we raised the ire of the security police. In terms of the emergency regulations, one couldn't report on a call for the boycott of national elections. Now, there were a few people who would break the emergency regulations with impunity, and those were the prominent religious leaders, particularly Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was emboldened with his Nobel Peace Prize and enjoyed significant international status. So he went out to a rally and called for a boycott of the elections. We had this information, but of course we couldn't report it. So we did it in an unusual way. We said Archbishop Tutu has delivered an address at a political rally in which he has made a particular call. We are unable to tell you what he said because in terms of section 15(2)(b), it is a criminal offence to report on anyone who calls for a boycott of the national elections. And you could work out quite easily what in fact he was saying. So we thought we were quite clever about him, we were quite smug. Until the next day, I got a very angry call from an anonymous security policeman who warned me not to be too clever in future. And that was part of the police tactic to intimidate us.
Our news gathering was helped by the fact that a large number of political activists listened to us, and they actually became sources. We had easy access to areas which were no-go for state-sanctioned journalists. We were able to report from wherever we wanted to. Subsequent, when the people came out of Robben Island, even before the bulk of them came out, Mosiuoa Lekota had been on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu. And one of the reasons why Lekota trusted us to take part in the great referendum debate was that he'd listened to us in prison on Robben Island. So he knew, and he could kind of vouch that what we tried to do was to be independent and fair news. All the people in Robben Island, Walter Sisulu mentioned when he came out, when I interviewed him for British television about listening to Capital Radio. Nelson Mandela joked about it the first time I met him. So yes, not all the time. It was dangerous for them to listen to. They weren't allowed radios for much of the time. It was only towards the end that they actually got free access to radio. But yes, a lot of them listened to it, sometimes in groups, sometimes individually. Saths Cooper, who's a leader of ZAPU, listened to it regularly in his cell on Robben Island.
In 1989, Capital 604 decided to open a satellite studio in the city of Durban. A few presenters worked from this new studio, while the rest remained in the Johannesburg Mill Park studios.
Kevin Savage phoned me, and I was working at a hotel down in Cape Town, and he said, would you like to come back to Capital and go on the breakfast show and do the breakfast show Monday to Friday from the new studio that we're going to build at the workshop. And the workshop had only just been built, and there was we put a shop there, and we said, this is fabulous. I went there, we started up the workshop studios, and again, another beautifully professionally built studio. And we ran a couple of shows a day from there as a satellite studio. Another 1 year later, they all decided, let's move out of Mill Park now and move to Durban. Let's go back to our audience. So we then moved all the studio to the old Lido building on the south beach of Durban. Again, another millions of dollars chucked into the studio.
I'd spent times with Peter Chamberlain, another great character of Capital Radio. Tony Morell, Peter Chamberlain, Oscar Renzi, and there we were having this picture taken of us of actually with these 5-10 pound hammers, which I could barely lift anyway, let alone swinging it into a wall. We really kind of got stuck into the construction of the studios. So they were absolutely fantastic. They had such an open plan space for all the presenters to be free and do what they did. But the most important thing of it all to remember is we were physically the only radio station broadcasting on the beach. So every day we used to go to work and we were going to the beach. It doesn't get better than that.
You know, when we moved to Durban and we were on the beachfront, and in the early 90s before I left, you know, I know how many efforts and how strongly people were trying, from Martin to Anthony to Barry to all these guys were trying their level best to, you know, to make sure Capital was there and in the front of the queue if things ever changed and stuff, and even trying to see if we could, you know, just make it a better signal and a better scenario and environment to work in and have a radio station in. I know how much they tried and how many meetings we went to and you know, how many times they tried to lobby this one in government and that one. Without knowing the details of that, you know, I knew this was going on.
In 1991, the ANC organized a huge seminar in Holland called Jabulani, Freedom of the Airwaves, whereby a future scenario had to be worked out that once there was a democratic government in power, what would the broadcasting scene be like? Considering that the Nationalist Party had kept it very sewn up to spew government propaganda out. So this was an opportunity in Holland for all of us to get together. I went over as a representative of the commercial sector, and there I met ANC officials, and as we hammered out what we could see in terms of the commercial, the public, and the community sector of radio and TV, I spoke to the ANC and told them of our plight, of what we had to go through to actually get a signal. And then eventually we organized a meeting with the ANC. There were three very top people, Carl Niehuis, Paulo Jordan, and Jill Marcus. And we told them of our trials and tribulations, and they promised to do something about it, that they'd bring it up with their National Executive Committee. And it didn't go anywhere. It so happened that after a period of time, perhaps up until 1992, it seemed that nobody wanted Capital Radio to really be there because they were speaking the truth. Their news was genuine. Would this be an impediment to the new government?
At a time when Capital 604 needed the most help to gain listeners and stay on air, an unfortunate event occurred. An unnecessary programming change driven by misguided management called Afritude was instituted.
So the Transkei government was still feeding money into Capital Radio. Martin Rattle just said basically I think he'd done his time, and Anthony Duke also, all of these guys just started to leave because unfortunately we just weren't able to get the numbers up. We weren't broadcasting to anywhere near enough people.
I was spending New Year's Eve in Umtata with old friends from Capital Radio, and we were drinking, and somebody I didn't know was sitting next to me in front of the fire, the braai as it is there, and he said to me, "I know who you are." He said, "You're David Smith. You used to work at Capital Radio." Yeah, that's me. "Have you been listening to Capital Radio?" he asked, "since you returned to South Africa?" "Yeah, I have been. Of course I have been. Well, I used to work there. What do you think of it?" "Well, I don't think it's very good. I think it's actually irrelevant what they're doing." Why is it irrelevant? Because Capital Radio has 7 FM transmitters in the Transkei, 2 medium wave transmitters in the Transkei, should be broadcasting to people who pick up that FM signal. But it's targeting basically white surfers living in Durban. I have nothing against white surfers. I hope they're having a good time. But they weren't listening to Capital Radio because it was coming through on a scratchy medium wave signal. A good idea. I mean, I don't want to make it all sound very bad because the news service was fabulous. And if you like top 40 pop music, that was very good too. But they weren't targeting the people where the transmitters were. And I rambled on to this guy for quite a long time about what I thought was wrong. And then he asked me, what should it be like? And I talked about making it relevant to the people of Transkei. And he said, very late in the night, probably the early hours of the morning, "Very interesting. Would you mind putting that down on paper and bringing it to my office tomorrow. That's when I thought it was a good time to ask, who are you? He said, I'm the Minister of Finance in the Transkei government. New Year's Day, he was sitting in his office. And I said, I've written down what you asked me to write down. And he took the paper, and he didn't even look at it. He put it on his desk and said, Major General Bantu Holomisa has authorized me to give you Capital Radio to do with it what you said you would do last night.
Well, in hindsight, it would have been great to have seen the market research that David Smith and the others who, saw a vision in this Afritude format. I'm not too sure if there was any, specific market research done. I don't think so, because the market research probably would have said those same listeners in the Transkei who want to listen to African language stations would be listening to the African language stations that the SABC were providing. The reason why Capital Radio drew an audience, especially in the Transkei, is because it offered something different. It offered something aspirational. It offered a format that the SABC weren't giving. And importantly, it delivered independent radio news, where we had the likes of Oliver Tambo being interviewed from Stockholm in Sweden, where we provided news that did not fall foul of the state censorship machinery, as the SABC had to provide South African audiences. So if those local Transkei audiences wanted to listen to a more African radio station in a language that spoke to the demographic of that region, then they would have, because there were African language services. So David Smith sadly managed to convince the powers that be.
I called a friend at Radio Netherlands. I called Francis Rolt and told Francis what had just happened. And I said, Francis, I will take this job if you agree to come and do it with me. Basically, I was raiding Radio Netherlands staff. And he said yes. So we both handed in our resignation on a train between Brussels and Amsterdam, as we were workshopping what we were going to do in South Africa when we arrived. And we came up with the word Afritude. Before I traveled from Amsterdam to Durban, where Capital Radio was then based, I made a side trip to Montreal. And this is an important little detail, because while I was there, I was interviewed by a Montreal newspaper, the Montreal Gazette, asked me what I was going to South Africa for. And I told them basically what I've just told you. And stupidly, I forgot about a machine called the fax. At the time, there was a South African trade office in Montreal. Somebody in the old South African trade office clipped that article and faxed it to Capital Radio. The story of what I was going to do to Capital Radio arrived before I did.
So then this chap arrived, and he was special. He was very special. I picked him up from the airport, and he introduced himself, and he said, I'm going to be the save and grace of Capital Radio. I told them back in the day when I was working in the news department, I told them that I was going to come back and save this station, and this is where I am. And they have called me from Canada, and I am now going to be the save and grace of Capital Radio.
I gathered everybody together. Francis was there. And I did what I thought was the right thing. I said, nobody here need lose his or her job. All of you have radio skills. You're all important people. You've got a lot of experience. Everybody is welcome to stay here. There will be some big changes. And I remember they pasted that fax of the newspaper article from the Montreal Gazette around the entire conference room. And so I remember saying, it was the only humorous part, at least for me, of that day. I said, I don't have to tell you why I'm here. You've read it already. Anyway, some people put up their hands right away and said, we don't want to work here. We don't want to work with them. We all know who them are. And fine, they were honest, and they left, and they got jobs in other radio stations or whatever.
I wasn't there at the time when this supposedly happened, but I can tell you from my 6.5 years of being close to Capital Radio, interacting with the radio presenters, interacting with the staff, as a person of color at the radio station, I did not find for a second anyone with any racist undertones. I did not feel uncomfortable. I was not made to feel a second-rate citizen. In fact, the contrary. The people were supportive. The legends who I looked up to in the 80s were all too keen to offer me guidance, support. Alan Pierce would snoop my show without me even asking him, and he'd come in half an hour early during the week and we'd sit and have a chat. Darren would give me feedback all the time. Richard Jones, Charlie Rasmus. I had never, and I don't think I've ever heard a story from any of my other colleagues who are working at Capital Radio of anything racist happening. So it surprises me that David Smith said that the Capital Radio staff, the white staff, said they don't want to work with any of them, which I suppose is in reference to them being, people of color. But the reality is that, from my perspective, I didn't encounter any of that, and I'd be surprised if anyone else did. But as I said, I wasn't there when this supposedly happened to David Smith, but in my view, I'd be immensely surprised and shocked if that story was true.
But most people did what most people do. They try not to lose their jobs. They said, "We're with you, David. We want to be part of this news station." Some of them truly were, but many of them weren't.
So we all worked with him for the first couple of weeks. And then he started making these crazy notions of, right, I want you on air, you're going to be on from 7 till 9, Steve Bishop, you're on from 2 till 4 in the morning, Alan Pierce will sort of mix you in wherever you need to be. And we were then put at these odd times, and he was bringing in these complete unknown people.
He changed everything. Because he couldn't, so far as fire all the white presenters, but he did make life incredibly difficult for us. He took me off the morning show and he put me on to the evening show, Monday to Friday, playing African jazz music between 9 and 12. And I loved this radio station so much that I wasn't about to be bullied. We were doing that 24 hours a day. And the problem with that is that we were getting constant feedback from our listeners, and it dwindled. We lost radical numbers in such a short space of time that we eventually had nobody listening to us.
And we ran Capital Radio right up until the day that they decided it was now going to change to Capital Radio, the station with an Afritude. And we all went to work normally on that last day, and then the next day we all got to work, and at 6 a.m. he changed it to the station with an Afritude and put this lady on who'd never been on radio before, and she just absolutely died a death. So did the guy after her, so did the guy after him, so did the girl after her, and it just went on right the way through the day. We were all sitting in our offices going, oh my God, what's happened?
Many of them then began attempts to sabotage the operation. The first day I put a black DJ on the air on the important morning slot, the breakfast show. One of the old technicians came into my office and started beating me up. Fortunately, another colleague came by and pulled him off me. I'm not really good at that sort of thing.
The way the South Beach studios, had been laid out, if anything happened in the public spaces or the offices that were on the rim of the dome, certainly more than one person would have heard it or seen it. And of course, our news and sport teams were in the newsroom all the time. So, surely if this did happen to David, as he claims it has, more than one or two people would have come forward to verify that story.
The office was petrol bombed one day. It was the last kicks of a dying horse in the old South Africa.
I have absolutely zero recollection of Capital Radio South Beach studios being petrol bombed. We would have heard stories of sabotage to our transmitters, which were scattered in the Transkei under the claims of a lightning strike. And then people were saying it was the Apartheid state security who are trying to take the radio station off air. But certainly in terms of petrol bombing the studios at South Beach, and I was there fairly regularly in the early 90s till the day the station shut down. and to my knowledge, the radio station was not petrol bomb. So, once again, I'd have to question that claim.
Unfortunately, what happens with people is that, you do meet people and you talk to them, and it's only after a little while you go, I know what it is. You're mad. And I did tell him so. So we called David Smith in and just said, this is crazy. This is nuts. This is not radio. This is just a bun fight. It's like children playing in a schoolyard.
It was difficult. It was allegedly a commercial radio station. I say allegedly a commercial radio station because it wasn't bringing in any advertising revenue. The station was working on what are known in the business as contra deals. A hotel offers free nights to staff in return for advertising. A restaurant offers free meals for staff in return for advertising. Very nice for the people who take advantage of this, but not good for paying salaries or bills or anything else like that. I banned contra deals and told the advertising staff to go out and find advertising revenue in Transkei. Now, for those who don't know, Transkei is predominantly African, predominantly black. They were only going to predominantly white or Indian businesses in Durban, and they refused to do that. And they said, no, we're not going there, it's too dangerous, we don't know them, they have no money.
So I was on air, but I'd also taken over the sales and marketing. Sharon Westcott was also involved in sales. She was doing all the sales out of the Durban studios. Myself and Sharon, we were going out on the road, and the advertisers were just going, everything you've got, please cancel it, please cancel it, please cancel it, please cancel it. Can we have our money back? No, sorry, that's already spent, so we'll see what we can do. Can we give you more advertising? No, we don't want the advertising. We don't want to be associated with it. And that's the feedback that we were getting. And we just went, oh, okay. I would then take that back to David Smith, and he would just go, they'll get used to it. And well, I don't think so. I don't think they will, really. We've created a bit of a monster here, and we can either slay it now back in it while it's still young, because this will not survive. It will then die of hunger.
So, the old staff went on, mutinied.
I then went down to Mthatha. We spoke to the powers that be, myself and Sharon, and we had telephone calls regularly, virtually every day with Mthatha, saying this is going to go horribly wrong. There is no more money. We are not going to be able, everybody's cancelling on us. We cannot sell this. So then they had to try and get rid of David Smith. And it was how radical was he becoming, what was his motive, and what was his end game. And what he had told the people in Mthatha was not a lot of what he was actually doing in Durban. So the next thing, he was gone, but I believe that it did cost a lot of money for them to get him out. And then put Capital Radio back, literally. So it had gone on for 3, 4, 5 months as this Afritude thing. And then it went straight back to the old Capital Radio. But then we had to try and start peeling all the stickers off, all the little colours from around the Capital Radio sign on the studios and outside the building. And okay, let's get that down. And does anybody know what happened to the old one? Yes, I think it's in the stock. Okay, let's get that back. Really, we'd upset too many people by that time. Certainly all the advertising agencies, that was like the point of no return.
I went to visit the Capital studio, Steve Smith. This is when they were in that old cinema thing, the big thing. Steve Smith was on air. And they had that carousel with the commercials. That thing that went around the commercials, all numbered. 3 commercials, that's all they had.
Then it just got to the stage, basically a year after that, there was just no more money. The Transkei government were feeding the money in. we weren't able, the transmitters were not being improved, we were not being granted FM status anywhere. The signal was still relatively bad in Durban, but you've now got to remember that the apartheid had already happened and gone, and now the SABC stations had all been granted these new FM status all over the place.
Convention for a Democratic South Africa, or CODESA, was an agreed-upon document that described how South Africa would transition to a democratic country. One area was broadcasting, where it laid out exactly how radio and television stations would transition into the new South Africa. As the new South African government was formed, the Independent Broadcast Authority, or IBA, was formed to open the airwaves, but also to obey what had been written in CODESA relating to broadcasting.
At the time, Capital Radio wasn't doing too well, if I may be absolutely blunt about it. They had relocated to Durban, and I think they had a thing, programming called Afritude. This was a whole new thing, and frankly, they were in debt. It was at about the time when Mandela had been released, CODESA was in action, and it was as a consequence of something that happened at CODESA that we made our pitch for Capital Radio.
I went into government at the same time as President Mandela to set up the first equivalent of a Federal Communications Commission, which we called the Independent Broadcasting Authority, and our job was to open the airwaves.
The consequence was, as a result of the IBA, who had only just been formed at the time, agreeing with CODESA that there would be a grandfathering clause for stations that had already established a relationship in South Africa. And they said they would give a grandfather clause for a particular date, and of course I can't remember the date now. But if they were broadcasting at that particular date in one particular footprint area, they would then be grandfathered automatically. You had to prove that. And I went off immediately to see Dave Cherry, who you may recall was the senior engineer at the time. And he said, yeah, we were on air at that time, but not only into Natal, we were broadcasting live into the so-called PWV, what we now call Gauteng. So it was into Pretoria, Johannesburg, and the environments, Vereniging, and we said, fantastic. So we put in our pitch on that, and we put together a very strong consortium.
We were all quite excited when word came out that Malcolm and a consortium were looking at taking over Capital Radio. It's not that we had a problem with Major General Bantu Lemisa or any of the board of directors out of Transkei, just that, we realized the radio station needed funding to take it to the next level. We realized it needed a vision and leadership that would fight for the radio station to have at least FM in KwaZulu-Natal and other parts of the Eastern Cape. We had FM transmitters in the Transkei. That would have been the right time, really, because the broadcasting landscape was changing. And it would have really positioned Capital Radio, especially on an FM transmitter in KwaZulu-Natal, Eastern Cape, and what was the Transkei, to have taken on some of those newly licensed former SABC radio stations that were going to be independent.
Malcolm came, did a whole presentation to the Transkei Military Council about the sale of Capital Radio and how he would take it over and do everything he was going to do.
We had a very good meeting. It was a great meeting. He had his entire cabinet there, and he sat in his chair with Capital Radio and a little radio right next to him, which I thought was divine. And I thought we had quite a nice conversation, but you can never tell.
And the moment he walked out the door, Holomisa just said, we're not selling Capital Radio. So I never knew why he went through all this process.
I can remember very well going to the IBA, which was in Rosebank at the time, and talking to one particular guy who was in charge of all of this stuff. And he shrugged it off and said, I'm sorry, but it's not coming into this area, not while I'm here. And off he walked. And I thought, I can't believe that you can do that.
Capital Radio was owned by the new government, and the new government seemed to be keep changing its position on what it actually wanted to do with Capital Radio. It didn't really have a clear idea. Capital Radio asked for an FM license. I can remember vaguely that was refused, but they should have carried on as an AM station. But the government never was really clear about what it wanted to do about Capital Radio, as I recall. May even have been suspicious of it.
I think that's a sad thing. When the IBA, which was the Independent Broadcasting Authority, came in, they
were, what can I say, they were already instructed by the then incoming government who should get the licenses and who shouldn't. So there's another reason Capital Radio was never going to get that license.
Despite the fact that we had a very coherent argument, we simply could not get the IBA to say, yes, you got a license. And so I'm afraid that's what happened. Eventually, my consortium folded up because it was costing a fortune to try and keep going with these guys, and I had to walk away.
You know, one of the urban legends that exists around Capital Radio and its demise is that its then opposition, which was East Coast Radio as it is today, did a little bit of this under the table, and you know, maybe, I don't know, it's talked about. But there was certainly the dirty tricks department was at play when it came to the demise of Capital.
There were some who argued very strongly that it was a product of the Homeland system, and as such it should not be allowed to continue in a post-Homeland scenario. Then there were those who, particularly with an interest base in KwaZulu-Natal, politicians, who wanted their own radio stations and went out of their way to actively block Capital application for a signal, Capital being very strong in KwaZulu-Natal at that particular stage and a very strong signal. And there were those whose economic interests were not served by the radio station continuing. It may have been better for them to start from scratch.
We tried. I don't know at what level discussions went, because we weren't privy to it. But internally, as a staff, we formed the Save the Capital Radio campaign. And we all got together and gave ourselves positions, or responsibilities rather, to try and do, and we wrote to certain bodies and institutions saying why we should be allowed to have an FM broadcast license. By that stage, there were very few of us left. And I remember that Steve Smith and Sharon Westcott, bless her, she could sell ice to an Eskimo. Stevie and her went out and we tried to secure the people that we lost. I think they deserve a medal, because I think we got back around about 80,000 listeners, which was fantastic in the short space of time.
I remember in mid-1996 there was a period where we were not paid, and they claimed that there was no money to pay the Capital Radio staff. I didn't know whether that was a ploy to get us to stop working and shut the station that way. But I think over those 2 or 3 months when there was no salary being paid, we kept the radio station running, and we had these reassurances from government that they are well aware of the role that Capital Radio had played, and they will sort it out. And to their credit, we did get paid, and we were back paid, and the monies came in. But that was just a false sense of security, because within 4 or 5 months after, they had shut down the radio station. So whilst we did get paid and they settled us, I think they did a much bigger disservice to our country and to the people of our country by closing down Capital Radio.
The clock was getting closer to striking midnight. We were being told that on this day and on this time, your radio station is going to be shut down, and there's nothing that you could do about it. So then there was panic. And then everybody was scuttling around. We were forming more committees and getting involved in what could we do? We're going to get on our hands and knees, and who could we go to? And there was nobody to go to. There was nobody that would take us seriously or listen to our plight.
The day before, we were still hopeful. A group of us had written a letter to the minister, urging the minister to please reconsider. We thought there would be a stay of execution. There were petitions. We had members of the public even calling the minister's office, both in Cape Town and in Pretoria. And through the day, whilst there was a level of sadness, there was still this immense hope that there's no way that this government that we helped fight for is going to shut us down.
It was thick. It was just thick. It was fuzzy. I mean, the word emotional has been used ad nauseum. And I was doing the Last Breakfast show, and you know what? It's as much as we like to be seen as men, and men don't cry. I found myself during Links, which was so silly, sobbing, absolutely sobbing, because of what was about to happen. But all through that day, there was just a camaraderie of special individuals and people who'd come far and wide to be part of that, just that one day, that last day of history.
And Kenny Maestri and I were then asked to co-host the final show, which was the afternoon drive show. And even in our planning of the show, we thought, well, we'll structure it with, reminiscing about Capital Radio, talking about day one. And then Kenny and I also planned to give an opportunity to Alan Mann, because if this was going to be the last day of Capital Radio, then the first voice of Capital Radio on that breakfast show on the 26th of December should be one of the last voices that Capital had. And obviously Bridge Over Troubled Waters was the first song the radio station played, and we said, well, if it is the last day, then let's sign off with that. But we were both still hopeful. We got into the studio at about 2:45. We started sorting out our jingles, laying out the music. By then, a lot of people had assembled at the radio station, not just our existing staff, but some former staff members, those who had secured jobs at the other radio stations. Then we had this outpouring of Capital fans. And it just made me realize how loved this radio station was. And Kenny and I got in, and we presented the first 2 hours. That was getting emotional. We realized that by 5 o'clock, there's no stay of execution, no letter, no telephone call coming from the minister or the minister's office. And by then, a few things had happened. There was this light aircraft flying around Johannesburg with this message, no more capital punishment. We had people calling us, taking pot shots at the SABC, who they had claimed was flying these banners. And it was Metro FM, and all of this was going on. So we were dealing, with this backlash from the audience who were already upset the radio station's closing. And now on our last day, as we're walking to the gallows, we've got other broadcasters in the country allegedly taking shots at us. So it was really difficult.
You give so much to something, whether it be a cause, whatever that is, but you give so much of yourself because you believe in it. And it sounds so good, and people love it. Die-hard fans, they're still around, they still remember Capital Radio. It's tragic, but that room, about 5 minutes to 6 o'clock, it was almost like you could hear a pin drop, because the inevitable was coming our way. We had fans outside the windows, and they were all looking in. And I'll never forget, Tracy Ferretta was just, the tears were streaming down. I think everybody had tears streaming down their eyes. It was just, the emotion was palpable at the best, but probably goes without saying, the saddest day of my life. And for many others as well that loved the radio station as much as we did, yeah.
We go into the final hour, and people just stream into the studio. It's something that I'd never forget. And in that final 20 minutes, we managed to get Alan Mann on the radio, and he gave us a He gave us a heartwarming message, and I think that's when I knew, this is it. Kenny and I prepared to say our goodbyes. We lined up Bridge Over Troubled Waters by Simon and Garfunkel, played the song, dropped in the final sting, and being true professionals, we wanted to wrap it up at 6 p.m. because that was the end of our show. And once that happened, the signal was cut, and that was it. I didn't even have a chance to clear my desk. We were ushered out of the building fairly quickly. But in those final 10 minutes, newspaper photographers, journalists, staff members, listeners, family, friends. And when that last jingle played, it was just the most emotional time.